So just a real quick introduction about how I got to where I am. I grew up very interested in nature. I was always outside playing, hiking. I would go up to the Maine, up to the coast there, and play around in the tide pools as a little kid. So I was always interested in nature. I went to college and studied marine biology there, where I had a ton of really amazing opportunities. I spent a lot of time out on boats, wading in the water, looking at different things. I got an opportunity to go down to the Bahamas where I did research on sharks and shorebirds and mangrove trees. And then I loved it so much that I went to graduate school to do my master's degree in marine science. And there I specifically have been studying seabirds. So the kind of work that I do with seabirds, there's really three settings that I work in. There's the field, the lab, and the office or my computer. So I'll share a couple of photos and just kind of talk about those. Let's see here. Okay. All right, so first I want to talk about the field work that I do. So behind me is the Freeman Seabird Preserve, which is a spot where a bunch of birds called wedge-tailed shearwaters live. And it's kind of funny because you can't really see them. Looking at this, it doesn't look like there's any birds there, but there's hundreds of birds that live here. They nest underground in holes in the rocks and little burrows in the sand. So the kind of work that I do out in the field, primarily we're doing things like seabird censuses, where we go out and count the populations of the birds that nest here. So me and some of my colleagues go out, and I kind of liken it to an Easter egg hunt because we're basically going out and looking under every bush and rock and in every hole trying to find birds on their eggs. And then when they hatch, we go out and look for the chicks. So we do things like measure the weight of the birds, we measure their wing length. Sometimes we band the birds so we can keep track of them if they come back. So that's one aspect of the field work. And then I do want to share a photo of one of my birds. Another thing that I really love about what I do is the opportunity to actually help birds and get a chance to rescue them. So this is me with a wedge-tailed shearwater. Now, one of the things that I do is, there we go. So one of the things that I get to do specifically with my job is help rescue birds that have been stranded. So a lot of these birds end up getting stranded on land when they're young and they have a hard time flying back to sea. So something that I get to do is help bring these birds in and give them a little rehabilitation and a little rest. And then when they're ready to go, we release them back out and they fly back out to the ocean. So working with the birds out in the field is one of my favorite things. Another component of what I do is working in the lab. So this is what the lab looks like. Mostly the work that I do in the lab are seabird necropsies. So when the birds die out in nature, people bring them to our lab and we dissect them and try to figure out what happened, why did they die. We look at things like their body condition. So were they really healthy or were they starving? We also look at what they've been eating. So we look at their stomach contents. And unfortunately in Hawaii, there's always a lot of plastic that we find in their stomachs. And that can be really concerning. So we look at things like that. We also take samples of their muscle and their feathers, and we send it in for isotope analysis to really find out what's going on there. So that's the kind of lab work that I do. And then I do a lot of work in my office on the computer too. So I spend a lot of time working with statistics, doing data analysis, and I'm also doing a lot of work with GIS. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with that or not, but it's basically an online software where you can map things and do a lot of spatial analysis. So I'll share this photo here. So let's see. Okay, so this is a map that I made of seabird colonies on Oahu, which is the island where I lived in Hawaii. So each one of these little bubbles is showing a colony where the birds live and the relative size. So these are the really big colonies, these ones are smaller. So the kind of work I do really varies, as you can see. There's a lot of field work, which is really fun, and a lot of computer work, which is really interesting. But yeah, there's really no typical day. It just all kind of depends where I'm at on different projects. Um, yeah, with that, I just want to see, does anyone have any questions so far?
I actually do have one. This is
Great.
Nikki. So this might be a silly question, but just curious, as you're trying to understand like the population and how many are there at a time, like with birds being so quick and flying back and forth, like how do you capture a realistic number when you can't, like, I don't know if you tag them sometimes, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually what we're counting is the number of chicks or eggs, because when the birds are still young, they stay in their burrows and they don't really leave. The parents will fly out to sea and bring them back their fish. But until the birds grow up, they're staying in the nest. So usually we're counting the chicks or the eggs, and that's where we estimate our populations from. Because the adults, like you said, they may or may not be there in their nest at the time. They actually spend most of their time out flying over the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So we really, most of our counts are coming from the young.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Hey Jen, I have a question as well. Two questions actually. One is that you mentioned the pollution aspect, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit more. Are you seeing an increase in the plastic consumption within the birds, or what is your experience with that? And then
Yeah.
two, I loved your statement that you said earlier in the broadcast that science is a tool for answering questions. So I was also wondering, is there a question that you recently had answered?
Yeah, so we have about, I just realized we have about 20 seconds left. I think I talked too much, so I'll try really quickly. Yes, we're seeing plastic in about all of the birds we find, so that is a big problem. And then science as a tool. Well, right now I answered a question about light pollution and science, and we have 5 seconds, so I'm gonna have to touch base with you after this because I think we're about to get cut off. Oh, actually, wait a minute, we have 50. So,
Yes, one more minute. That's perfect.
So, yeah, so for my master's research, I was studying the effects of light pollution on seabirds. And the birds, when they leave their nest for the first time, are attracted towards light, and they end up stranding on land. And that's where we get a chance to, rescue them and study them in that way. So one of the things that I was looking at was whether a change in street lights, because they recently changed the street lights to new LED lights, if that had any change on the number of birds that were affected. And what I found is it didn't, which is fine. But yeah, anyways, it's really cool to be able to use the scientific method to answer these questions.